Today I share with you key findings from my book, Latino City, Urban Planning and Politics and the Grassroots. It's a case study of the way discourse, planning, practice, and the politics of development contribute to the idea of spatial alienation and gentrification. And I focus on the downtown core of the central city of Santa Ana, located in Orange County, about 32 miles south, which we know is about an hour drive, or maybe even more. I wrote the book, in essence, to trace the origins of the processes and some outcomes of the concept of spatial alienation and gentrification. And I tie a lot of this to the 70s, and I'd like to move onward to the early 2010s. So one of the things that I really like to highlight is this temporal scope of development over time, and not isolating a lot of what we see in more recent times in terms of downtown development in a very narrow focused time frame. And I also like to share some responses and debates that have emerged over time, and what are some similarities and differences that we see across time in terms of models of development and responses from the community to these changes that we see. And so in terms of the big picture, what are some urban planning, political economy trends that we're seeing that are not necessarily unique to Santa Ana or Santana? I'll go back and forth referring to the city of Santa Ana, but that we tend to see across the country and even globally. We're entering 2020, and working class municipalities in the United States are both under siege and experiencing a quote-unquote renaissance. Amidst these dual scenarios, we have the most economically deprived and spatially alienated struggling to remain and help define their city's future. Elected local leaders and partnerships with the private sector are increasingly promoting the idea of a back to the city movement. Spearheaded, I argue, largely by particular models of development: new urbanism, design focus, creative class development, more cultural programming, arts with some economy aspect to it, and transit-oriented development. So I see these three models working in tandem in this back to the city movement. And what we have is a reorganizing of the commercial character and housing landscape of a lot of these central cities, which are very familiar to many of us in the settings here outside university, as well as in the city of Santa Ana. And some end results are strategic acceleration of gentrification and displacement. At the same time, we also see grassroots resistance to these processes around the country. And so I tend to think that the book is a unique contribution because it combines these different types of models of development to understand the concept of gentrification. And I combine ethnic studies, theoretical perspectives, urban planning, urban sociology, and I also highlight the responses to some of the gentrification and displacement that we see. And of course, the relevance, I'm hoping that it has some relevance, especially for our students here today. I think the benefits of a talk like this are the ones that come after the presentation. And I also welcome some midway through the presentation, so you don't hear me speaking all the time. I tell my students, more of you is less of me, and it creates a more engaging conversation. So midway through the presentation, we'll have that opportunity to reflect, and also post-presentation is where I really want to see how we could discuss some of your theoretical views, some of the methods that you're using, and how we could bounce our ideas around with that. So I work with the concept of spatial alienation, and that's an urban sociology concept by Kant. And this is a concept that I use to help tie a lot of what I saw across time. And the way I define and take this concept together is as follows. Redevelopment that intends to improve urban areas, defines areas as blight, further marginalizes and reduces to invisibility an already marginalized demographic, and seeks to drive the demographic out of sought-after areas for more desirable demographic groups. I approach the concept with the assumption that working towards and achieving spatial alienation is about power, and spatial alienation is not always obvious in practice. So blending a little bit of this kind of policy analysis, Foucauldian idea, that we really have to dig deep to see how the concept of power works, and then how does it work in the concept of redevelopment, and how is it tied to gentrification is something that really drives me. And so looking at concepts and changes across time, as I mentioned earlier, is really important to me. So when I narrow down to, okay, what exactly am I going to focus when I look at redevelopment, here are the key bullet points or the takeaways. That I really look at this idea of how do you socially construct problems? What does that look like? And then how do we imagine communities? At the same time, I was interested to understand is how do you erase particular communities? So it's not just to imagine particular communities or socially construct problems, but I also argue that there's also a process of erasing. So all of these processes happen in tandem, and the question is, where do we uncover them and to what extent do they make a difference? And so specifically here, how is it that we find the idea of erasure with particular communities in Santa Ana, the Mexican immigrant, and the economically deprived, I borrow from Marcuse, which really works in our understanding as the working class and the working poor. At the same time, what are those practices? So when we move from concept and text, for the policy analyst here, when we move from the text and the, what are some practices that are used in policy to prioritize these future and privileged communities? Okay, so we have different scenarios moving on. And embedded in this, again, is some of the, not just looking at some grassroots practices, but one of the things I want to point out, that I want to tease out, is also looking at this idea of contradictions with the grassroots. So we have Orange County on the right, and for those of us that are not familiar, we have the city of Santa Ana here in the middle. And essentially what we're looking at, this is the way I would define the downtown core area. And when I talk about the commercial heart, I'll refer to it as La Cuatro or 4th Street. 4th Street is the actual street. And historically, since the early 1900s to the present time, 4th Street contains that commercial heart of the downtown. Although over time, what commercial heart means and what it looks like and who it serves primarily has meant something different. And essentially, when you look at the Civic Center, the Station District here, bounded over here, we have a Barrio Logan, one of the oldest barrios, neighborhoods, Mexican working immigrant, Mexican-American neighborhoods. Then over here, we have another larger barrio, Mexican immigrant, working class, primarily Lacey Neighborhood here. And over here, we have the Civic Center. And Dr. Sloan was talking about an art show that he went to, primarily spearheaded by an arts district that was created in 1994, roughly around here. And this is 4th Street. 4th Street, in essence, where the commercial heart has been, is roughly, and this is a map that I did on MapQuest today, roughly 0.4 miles. It's not this huge 2-mile block. And even to these, looking to the sides of the smaller streets, there's maybe a few amount of stores. It's essentially this one street. Okay. Let's look at some demographics for background context. And in the city of Santa Ana, I focus here specifically from the 60s to the 80s for our earlier discussion. From 1960 to 1980, during that time period, we have 100,000 population growth. That's quite significant. I'm not sure if we have any cities nearby in recent memory that any of us could say, oh yeah, I just went to this one city. It grew by 100,000 people in 20 years. So this is huge. At the same time, in 1960, we see that the city, over 80% white, Latino 15%. By 1980, it's already at 44.5, 45, in essence, the same demographic. So you see the shift, not only in size, but we also see a shift in racial and ethnic composition at the same time. In 1960, the immigration population was at 6.9, just under 7,000. By 1980, we're at 62. We have those numbers there. At the same time, we know some U.S. history and Mexican history. We've always had Mexican connection, and Southwest, it was Mexico at one time. But we also know with the Bracero program, and I'm not going to get too much into a lecture discussion here that I have in my Introduction to Chicano Studies class, but Orange County and in Santa Ana, agriculture is booming, is one of the main, and so we had this labor, what's often referred to as a guest worker program, in the Bracero program that also helped fuel a lot of immigration. And as I discussed in terms of policy, When we talk about policy, humans are not robots. It's not just we need your labor, then go back. People sustain communities, families. So in many respects, the Bracero program, when the Second World War started for the past 20 years, was also a big driver to help facilitate this immigration. And so those are some of the reasons. And of course, we are, for most of us, if we're not familiar, federally, we have white flight, the suburbs, Federal Housing Authority, FHA loans to 98% non-white communities to help facilitate opportunities in the outskirts of central cities. So I think all those variables combined help us understand this unique, some of this in Santa Ana. I want to focus to the 70s. So when the question about development and change comes up, initially when I began my research to try to understand how this change happened, one of my first questions was not, should you look to the 60s and 70s to help understand what's going on in the 90s and the 2000s? Initially, that wasn't even in my periphery. But doing a lot of archival research, I started reviewing urban plans, community development reports, grant reports from the city, and going through essentially every plan that I would find downstairs in the history room. I started to say, wait a minute, there's a bigger picture here that I need to understand the present debates. And I think one of the most striking documents that I found that helped me encapsulate some of the storylines, some of the narratives that I was seeing across documents in the 70s and in the 80s, and granted, this is really more pronounced than you see in all those other texts, is this map in the 1974 plan. The 1974 plan for the downtown was the first major comprehensive developmental plan for the city of Santa Ana. They had initially reorganized and established like a community development department, and so a lot of funds were increasingly being available to a lot of municipalities throughout the country. And this map, while you can't really see the details, I strategically included, I have a remake, but I put this is your 1974 GIS map. Okay, and essentially what we have is problem identification of the downtown area by highlighting particular communities. What we have here, the 4th Street, the problems were cruising / gangs, illegal immigrants, drug activity, transient populations. And in the outskirts, the general theme was relatively stable communities, and those are the main concepts that you see throughout the map to say, we need to do something about these communities here. These are, in essence, barriers to the redevelopment that we want. And so, in essence, that was something that I would here define as social blight. Physical blight is something that's more common and quantifiable in many respects. And 67% of the downtown area infrastructure and buildings were deemed substandard. That, on a scale of 1, 2, 3, substandard was the highest, the lowest score, if you will. Okay, they only had a 3-point Likert scale. And 23% of these buildings were identified as having seismic deficiencies. So as a bumper sticker statement is, there's a lot of work to do here. There's a lot of social blight and physical blight. If we look at this map as an easy roadmap for redevelopment, this is what we have here. I'm saying it's sufficient because that's, I think, what the plan was communicating. When you have the consultants and city staff, through my reading of the report, they did a survey, a walkthrough, and a scale of 1 to 3, 3 being the worst off rating, if you will, of a building, that substandard was the worst off. So 67%, I think, sends a signal that they need attention. So that's 74. So I'm just going to give you some quick overviews, and of course all the details are in the book. I also want to bring attention that by 1977, you're having a new grassroots emergence in the city. And it's not a coincidence that it's been 3 years since the 74 plan to 77 that you're starting to have a lot of residents forming, coming together to challenge a lot of the community development that is slated And it's not necessarily through my reading of my research, they don't say the 1974 plan is going to do this. No, there's smaller projects, but I think 3 years afterwards really does tell us that people were becoming aware of city plans to redo the downtown. By 77, you have 7 distinct different neighborhoods throughout the city of Santa Ana coming together. So middle class white neighborhoods, working class, Mexican American, working class, Mexican immigrant communities, some of the older barrios, they all came together to form the Santa Ana Neighborhood Organization. And sure, they all may have had collective goals, but within specific neighborhoods, they also had individual objectives to pursue their interests. And I briefly share here with you some of their successes that from 77 to the early 80s, some of the achievements that they had was trying to allocate more resources for the specific neighborhoods. So they had an influence on city budget. And we see a lot of these victories and a lot of the more grassroots perspectives and more local publications, grassroots publications that you see coming out, and oftentimes these publications are in Spanish and in English. It was more difficult for me to find the same type of coverage of the grassroots emerging in the 70s and the 80s from mainstream English language newspapers. And tying it back to the seminar and graduate students and those of us that are pursuing research, I take the opportunity to highlight that oftentimes when we do research with particular communities, it's important to kind of dig deep to understand what is archival material, where can we find information. And I was very fortunate to find some of these newspapers at Cal State Fullerton in the Chicano Latino Resource Center, where faculty from the 70s and 80s took it upon themselves to save newspaper clips and local publications from, I have no idea how they came across them, but they saved them in file cabinets. And that's one way I was able to kind of repiece a grassroots story. By the 80s, here we have LA Times coverage. We still see the similar trends and narratives, ambitious redevelopment plans, but we do also have here attention to some of the resistance that we see. Low-income residents of downtown Santa Ana staged two protests at the Civic Center Tuesday, arguing that the city's redevelopment policies are effectively moving them out in favor of more affluent people. Lopez is charged that low-income housing is being neglected, quote unquote, is not valid, Swanson said. We're trying to make sure that there's a mix of different people in Santa Ana. By the 80s, you start to see, as we see here, some improvements in the downtown. This is 4th Street. Some improvements of the downtown. This is mostly street repair. I was not fortunate enough, and this is something that I want to add to my research in the future, I was not fortunate enough to come across pictures at the Santa Ana Public History Room during my research of the 70s and 80s of the downtown area, specifically of 4th Street. This is one that I did find. It's not the most telling of the social, cultural, commercial landscape, but I think it's also telling again in terms of there's gaps of information and also visuals available this time period. Nevertheless, it was during the 80s, well, it began in the 70s, but certainly by the 80s, one longtime merchant who opened up a business in the late 60s, early 70s, he had a record store, discoteca, and eventually had other businesses up to the present time. He just passed away about a year and a half ago. He talked about the 80s in downtown Santa Ana, saying by the 80s, he had a quote, and then he said, and 4th Street boomed. And so for him and for others, by the 70s and the 80s, downtown 4th Street had now taken a working class Mexican immigrant commercial landscape, very much contrasting to the early 1900s, 30s and 40s and 50s, middle upper class 4th Street that used to serve not only Santa Ana, but the region in general. High-end stores used to be on 4th Street. And to give you a sense of what are some of those anchors that help change what a lot of city documents and mainstream media would call a dying downtown from the 70s and late 60s and even the 80s and to the present time, We have the Yost Theatre, one of the oldest theaters in Orange County. By the 70s, Louis Olivo Sr., a Mexican-American man, purchased the theater. And from the 70s to the 80s, he had all the main attractions there. If you're a Frank Sinatra fan, Michael Jackson fan, Prince fan, or any other artist that you would put in your top 2 all time, translate that to Spanish language Mexican artists, they were at the Yost Theatre. Okay, that's how huge it was. So you have Vicente Fernandez, who sings rancheras with mariachi music, talks about rural life, struggles to survive, immigration. Same thing with Antonio Aguilar. Juan Gabriel, more pop, mainstream music, one of the most influential and known composers and writers, talented musician, performed there. And this gives you a sense of Spanish language newspapers that document a lot of the movies that would also be played at the Yost. Cantinflas, probably the most famous comedian actor, Mexican comedian actor. So the Yost Theatre was an anchor for entertainment for Orange County Mexican speaking Spanish communities. Louis Olivo Sr. commented that they would send buses to the fields to help bring people who are working in agricultural fields to the Yost Theatre. The other anchor in the downtown area that helped shift the identity to La Cuatro was La Canada. It's a shoe store. It opened in 1973. At that time, it was the largest family shoe store in all Latin America, based out of Guadalajara in Mexico. So they opened up on the corner of Main and 4th, in essence, in the heart, commercial heart of the downtown. And so that was in 73. And so you have this huge, you start to have this slow change. And I think in the early 70s when you start to see the shift. Nevertheless, before the 70s, you already had the Yost Theatre. So definitely by the 80s, all the vacancies that you did have and all the different businesses that you start to see emerge, what once was perhaps a bridal store now slowly became a bridal/quinceañera store. Okay? You start to see the emergence of travel agencies. Okay? You start to see the emergence of discotecas, record stores, with big speakers, serving Vega speakers, 15-inch speakers outside, blasting a lot of Spanish language music. You start to see the emergence of a lot of hair salons. Okay, so those will give you an example of the changes that you see in the downtown area. So this is what you have now as a street level view. This is Google Street Level. This is probably a Saturday morning, 9 in the morning. You have few cars, but you don't see any people there, so that's why I would say it's early in the morning. This business hasn't opened yet, but it gives you a sense of the stores that you see here. Okay, Starbucks opened in about 2003, just down the street here. Okay, when you take a more busy look of the day, these are pictures that I've been taking from 2008, 2011, 2014. I wanted to chronicle a lot of the street life that's been going on. And so here you see a street vendors. Here you see the quinceañera stores, Sweet 15, the coming of age celebration, a Catholic tradition, very popular in Latin America. So you have, as of like about 6 years ago, you had about 14 of these type of businesses throughout 4th Street. Here you see a busy, crowded sidewalk. Young folks, families is what you tend to see. And here I'm buying churros at a restaurant. This man was coming into the restaurant and selling his some snacks. I mentioned earlier when I showed you the map, the Lacey Neighborhood. This is a Lacey Neighborhood. It's embedded within the Station District. And the Lacey Neighborhood, it has light industrial, industry there. And one of the walks that I had, I happened to catch some of the workers playing soccer, hopefully during their break, here. And here you see a brownfield, an empty lot next to a home and apartment buildings. In 2004, the Rockefeller Foundation released a report, and what they did, they wanted to identify urban hardships across the United States. And they had 5 different variables: overcrowding, poverty among them. They brought together different sources of data, obviously. And when they came up with a composite score of urban hardships in 2004, Santa Ana was number 1. And of course, you have Detroit and you have other cities that we tend to learn about in terms of U.S. planning history, in terms of places with deindustrialization and other issues. Santa Ana ranked number 1. The Lacey Neighborhood is as characteristic or as representative of those urban hardships as any other area or neighborhood in the city of Santa Ana. You see here. Here, can you tell what number, can you read what that number is there?
88 cents.
Yeah, so it's not even a Dollar Tree. It's not even a dollar store. It's 88 cents. And so here you also have networking, your social media, survival, employment opportunities, people posting, I'm renting a room or I'm seeking a room. I offer X and Y services. And that's a place where the community goes and posts. And that's, I guess, the equivalent to your Instagram or your Facebook in real time here. And here, this here is a city-owned property that since roughly the late 90s, early 2000s, the city wanted to embark on a rail system trolley. And of course, it would connect to the Station District. So to do that, it would have to connect, as I mentioned, I showed you the map, through the Lacey Neighborhood, through the downtown 4th Street area, onward to other cities, Garden Grove being another principal city. So the city started acquiring, purchasing properties, boarding up properties, in some cases demolishing, putting up fences, in other cases boarding, leaving them up. And the majority of the properties that they had bought by 2007, which was about 78 at that time, were in the Lacey neighborhood. By 2007, the city now, since 1974, now releases its most comprehensive redevelopment plan for the downtown under the name of the Renaissance Specific Plan. It covered about 420 acres, the Civic Center, the 2 neighborhoods that I mentioned, the Commercial Heart, First Street, the other large street near 4th Street, the Civic Center, were the main components. One article in the LA Times referred to the Renaissance Plan envisions instant gentrification. And so it was in 2007 that it wasn't the first time that merchants or even grassroots leaders who have been noticing changes in the area became aware of city intentions to revitalize the downtown, but it did become a more concrete roadmap to show the seriousness of concrete thinking of what are some of the ideas that the city was going to try to put forward to bring a renaissance to the downtown. And that's going to be my focus of this part of the presentation. And so from 2007 onward, here's 2011, you start to see a slew and increase of media, not just local LA Times, Orange County Register, but you also have USA Today, you have the New York Times, and other local magazines. So you have heightened attention to the city of Santa Ana for a lot of the new redevelopment that's going on and community protest. Here, this captures some of the new faces and a contentious revival. And here, I contrast this narrative to what we have in a 2005 newspaper article. La Opinión, the largest Spanish language newspaper based here in LA, said downtown Santa Ana, and this is translated, emulates many cities in Mexico. 4th Street between Main and Broadway is the largest commercial area of this orange metropolis, and where the slogan is Made in Mexico. So one of the things that I found in my research is also looking at the differences in the narrative, the story that's being told across different types of media outlets. In the Spanish language, for the most part, as a blanket statement, I did find a lot of this affirming type of perspective towards the downtown and what the downtown does for immigrant working class communities. Okay, this article here wasn't just about the downtown; it was about the whole city. but when it talked about the downtown, that was the narrative, that was the story. Versus mainstream, you either see, okay, there's debates going on, or it's more pro-redevelopment with some mention of gentrification. And when there's mention of gentrification, the unnatural transformation of a working class, working poor area to a middle upper class area, you'll have storylines that longtime merchants are trying to adapt, or there are debates going on. That's kind of, in essence, the storyline. And so by 2007, and giving you some of the main threads, and going back to the 70s and 80s, I didn't focus on the 80s much, and there's more stories to that, and we could discuss it later. But one of the takeaways is that at the end of the day, what I started to find from the Renaissance plan back to the 70s is that the idea of reimagining the area for more privileged communities, more middle-class communities, and in Orange County, that would be more the middle-class white population, residents, whether consumers or residents, because we have consumers and residents. You don't have to live somewhere, but you could shop somewhere, okay? At the end of the day, we start to see that the reimagination, the idea of spatial alienation and gentrification has been consistent. What I see it's different is just the language and the models that are used, and here's where I'm going to explain some of that. So what I wanted to highlight is, in the city, the main drivers in terms of models of redevelopment, transit-oriented development, the trolley that I mentioned that has been envisioned since the early 2000s, even to the present time, the existing train station that's there, creative class redevelopment. In 1994, the city created what's called the Artist Village, with heavy subsidies totaling about $8 million for different property owners, and also partnering with the university. So there's also universities that are often also implicated with gentrification debates in their surrounding cities. There's Grand Central building that houses art students from Cal State Fullerton. It was part of the creative class, and also rehabbing buildings for property owners had forgivable loans to rehab them and attract artists. And then new urbanism. I think the easiest way to communicate new urbanism, it's really design focused. And I think work-live lofts are the most clear example of new urbanism, and in terms of living. And in essence is to try to design compact areas to reduce normative ideals, reduce auto dependence, help the climate, increase social interaction, and having a community within the community. Everything's close to you. And so here's a train station. These are off the website that I got from the city or the respective institutions. Here is Santiago Street Lofts, just across from this train station, embedded in the Lacey Neighborhood. And here's the Artist Village here. So one of the quotes that I wanted to share with you, I have it here. So this is a regional magazine, and primarily targeting more affluent communities in Orange County. And in this magazine, what I started to see, again, some of the ironies and some of the different perspectives that we see emerging in 2009, Agustin Gursa, who wrote for this article, used to write for the LA Times just years prior to being hired from this magazine. And he used to cover a lot of Latino issues, if you will, labor issues, community life issues. And now he's covering the city that he's familiar with for this Orange County magazine. And this is what he says. Quote, Santa Ana now stands for something, and it's not gangs or illegal immigrants. It stands for art that's edgy and experimental, informal and anti-establishment, as the artists themselves define it. Now the narrative you start to see is different ways to identify and define communities. You have artists. And this is not unique to the city of Santa Ana. For those of us that study redevelopment, artists are often some of the communities that are eventually driven out of spaces, but also help anger the changes of gentrification. In every community, is different. As researchers, that's one of our jobs to see what does this look like in terms of the artist question. But in Santa Ana, again, he's referring largely to the artist village. Again, that was heavily influenced with subsidies, about $8 million from the city of Santa Ana. That precedes the Renaissance plan, and really the first example of city production of gentrification of the downtown area. So I want to shift to the Renaissance plan. And I mentioned that oftentimes it's not so much what we see or how language is expressed, but it's also how things are erased. So when it's about looking at texts and visions, what about the idea of erasing? So here's some quotes from the Renaissance plan where it looks at a current scenario, not necessarily giving it a normative or a positive spin, but really saying that the commercial character that's there just has much more potential than what it's providing. Okay, and that in many sense is really a play of language and words. You're not going to berate an existing area. You're not going to give it this language that you see in a 1974 plan, right? So I think we have more sophisticated ways to draft plans now. But one thing that you can do in these plans is remove imagery and provide your own imagery in terms of what are some desirable types of businesses. The talking room, these are examples from the Renaissance plan. The talking room, classic cafe dining, or fine oriental carpets, etc. For example, in the downtown area, you also have a Taqueria Guadalajara, or you have Daniel's Jewelers. You don't see any affirmation or acknowledgement of potential or sustaining particular businesses, but I think these are things as researchers that we need to look out for. Another thing that I wanted to point out is there was an article that came out in 2011 by Gustavo Arellano, who wrote for the OC Weekly, now for the LA Times. And for him, he was pretty much saying La Cuatro as its identity is dead. And for me, and as researchers, I like to tease that out. Can we make that blanket statement? And so what I started to do, and I detail it in the book, is taking pictures of every storefront. And I started creating categories and typologies of, and documenting all the store signage, all the marketing on the windows. And I wanted to get a sense of these businesses. Who are they marketing to? And in essence, the big picture is that a lot of the changes attracting marketing to more middle class, non-immigrant working class communities would be on what's called now the East End, which again has been heavily resourced by city funds. So you have 4th Street here, you have the East End and the Artist Village. So in essence, it's working inwards. The changes in terms of the commercial landscape are working inwards toward the heart of La Cuatro. And so my next research project is really doing some digital mapping of some of those changes and also looking at business directory to get a better sense of these changes over time. The idea of reimagining, what does that look like in practice? Well, the plan is very clear in terms of its market. The potential entrants are those who have the ability to pay market rate. And the idea is to really bring integration into the city of Santa Ana with those who are able to pay market rate. Now that's with housing. One of the things that I found from 2000 to 2010, I was curious, we have this commercial aspect that I focus on, and I didn't focus a lot in housing, but I did take a look at some data. And the big picture is that we see a reduction in residents with the two major areas in the downtown area. And largely we have new types of housing. If we take lofts as an example, I would guess that lofts have something to do with it. They're for smaller families in a sense. So not only do we have a decrease in the resident base, but we also have a shift in composition of the racial, ethnic composition in terms of housing. Okay? So these are evolving commercial housing debates and even demographic changes concretely that we see. What about, and then in terms of housing, from 2014 to 2017, moving post-Renaissance plan, we see that the overwhelming amount of new housing is market rate. And for any housing advocate here, or those of you interested in housing issues, we know that at the heart of a lot of grassroots debates is this issue of housing affordability. What's market rate? What's affordable? And here we see a glaring disparity in terms of how that works. One thing that I want to point out for all of us who are interested in this whole idea of public policy and the influence of public policy in generating gentrification, specifically commercial gentrification. I would urge all of you not to focus strictly as business enterprises making these individual level decisions to paint their buildings, cater to a new clientele, and that once you add all those individual level decisions, then you start to see changes in landscape. I think what's also important for us is to dig deeper and to question and start interrogating and looking at what are some public policies that are being created in partnership with some businesses in downtown areas. This here is a good example of why we need to look at that. There was a grand jury report that was released that looked into an arrangement, it's a private-public business district, if you will. And so there was a business district that was established, and the essence of the story is that particular property owners, or a particular entity of a property owner who has a large influence in the area and owns a lot of properties, strong ties with family history there, was able to work out a deal with the city to create votes. Who wants to vote to tax ourselves to be able to then increase our marketing, help make some upgrades, right? This whole idea of decentralizing responsibility, privatization, if you will, of some of the city traditional functions. And some of the things that the city found, the grand jury report found was that the overwhelming amount of grant money was allocated to particular property owners. And at the same time, there was also a discovery that a lot of the voting that went on to create this new business district, if you will, and was contested, was that it only allowed property owners to vote, and the weighing of votes was such in a way that really favored a lot of the approval of the yes/no voting on the property business district. In essence, that was challenged, and that business district disbanded, but a lot of the players who supported it just created a new district. So I urge you to look into the role of public policy and other documents. And to conclude, I wanted to share with you that in 2007, I was part of an organization called the Santa Ana Collaborative for Responsible Development. It was about August, September, where maybe 30 of us came together. That's when the Renaissance Plan was released in September, and we're like, what is this plan about? What is it going to do? We need people to help us understand this language. What are these models? And it was at that time that I had just recently graduated from UC Irvine. I had just recently started my position at Cal State Fullerton. I was living in Santa Ana, and I joined the collaborative to try to make sense of what was going on. What are the implications of what all this means? And so one of the things that we did was came up with 28 policy recommendations. And I detail in the book the whole process that we went through. And some of the bumper sticker statements that I provide is that this type of work is messy, and embrace the messiness, unpredictable, and time-consuming, and it's not linear. And it takes a lot of time to be engaged at the community level, because a lot of times you are trying to pursue and understand particular interests, whether it be housing or commercial, for particular vulnerable communities. When it comes down to it, a lot of times the city will say, you have a critique, what's your answer? How do you propose a change? And then how are you going to pay for it? And so as a collaborative, those are some of the overarching questions that we had to deal with. We created 28 policy recommendations. Some of those were influenced by our discussions, and some of us created a neighborhood survey. We had community forums. We try to be very conscientious of the different ways of understanding community perspectives. And one of the points that I want to bring out is this idea of grass tips and grassroots, where grassroots I would define as those that are affected daily by decisions and experiencing them are the grassroots. The grass tips would be professionals like me, who blend with the grassroots or attempt to have grassroots ideals, but at the end of the day, I'm a professional. I don't walk that sidewalk. I don't wake up and get out of that door and see the changes that are going around me immediately, even if I do live in the city. Okay? And so initially, we were grass tips. A lot of us were professionals. Even the community organizers will call professionals. And so we struggled, and a subgroup of us said, we can't continue to be as well-intended we are, define recommendations for what we want to do. And so it took us time to engage resident, working class fathers, mothers, people to be part of the sacred. Within about 4 years, 3.5 years since the founding of Sacred, the membership shifted. And today it's primarily, if not overwhelming, maybe 90% of the membership are grassroots. And so we offered a community benefits agreement, something similar that was done for the Staples Center here many years ago. That was rejected. We negotiated with the city. We had residents help lead some of the negotiation. While the CBA was rejected, we did get some wins. For example, one of the things I point out is that the issue of housing affordability, the concept of affordability could be not too affordable in terms of practice for many communities. So we really had to tease out how do we negotiate and what do we mean? What levels of affordability? How many units do we think should be affordable? So that's just one example of some of the work that we did. Cultural social preservation was another issue. Open space was another issue that we tackled across those 28 recommendations. So future research, I want to engage in digital mapping to get a better sense of the changes across time and create a different way to share that information. Through digital media, I think it's one of the most popular ways to do that. I'm also working on an edited book on gentrification and alternative futures. I'm interested to see, well, what are people doing in practice as an alternative future versus just critiquing and identifying the process. Okay? And for you, I think one of the takeaways that I want to share with you is don't lose sight of the idea of production. Oftentimes in gentrification, right, the unnatural transformation of a working class, working poor area to a middle upper class area, I like to focus on the idea of the production side. Look at the public policy side. Okay? The other aspect that I want to bring to your attention is this idea of temporal scope. To the extent possible, when we see changes or proposed plans, think about to what extent would it be useful for your research to expand your scope of analysis on the public policies that are going on. What are the urban politics that are going on with that? And at the same time, a lot of the work that I did here was archival research and collection of materials, but I also did engage in the community, as I mentioned, in 2007. And that engagement, I can't tell you, it's impossible for me to say one way or another, but I'm confident that my perspectives, my knowledge that I gained from that would not have, it was paramount, it was important. But don't forget to complete your coursework, right? One of the things as an advisor and going through this, you could engage, and sometimes engaging in the community could take a lot of time. So I'm not here to, don't forget your coursework. As a professor, don't forget your coursework. And yes. And then at the same time, Marcuse talks about the idea of the materially deprived and the culturally alienated. So he breaks down this idea of understanding community. One of the things that I want to bring up that now I start to see a lot in these, whether it's Boyle Heights or Santana, for example, you have middle class, Mexican, Chicano, primarily first generation born parents of immigrants who, for example, professional, I would probably fit in that category, want to open up their own business. You know, they want to reinvest in their community. They're not leaving, right? They want to invest. And so they're not just thinking about their individual human capital, but they want to invest in their community. What does that mean in terms of gentrification? When the analysis of gentrification has a class component, and so all those debates are going on now. The concept that is used to describe the tensions that are going on in terms of middle class, Mexican or Chicano, first generation born, opening up businesses, and then how these are displacing the working class immigrant businesses. It's called gentrification. Gente for people, in Spanish is people. And so that's something that we're starting to see a lot in different communities. Example is Boyle Heights or Santana, where we have, so it's not just this binary white and communities of color, but in certain areas we also start to see this other dynamic. And so the idea of a materially deprived, the most vulnerable class aspect versus the cultural aspect, there's still an opportunity to tease that out when you're doing your work. So in conclusion, I again want to thank Dr. Marlon Barnett, which I understand, I checked on Twitter, he made it safe to his transportation conference yesterday, I believe, to DC. I think he's in DC. Marlon was a professor of mine at UC Irvine. I thank him. Dr. Lisa Schweitzer, Elizabeth Currit-Halkett, and all of you, thank you so much for attending today's talk. Thank you.